When Rodrigo Duterte was elected as president of the Philippines in May 2016, hopes were raised for a negotiated end to one of ASEAN's longest-running Maoist insurgencies. On the campaign trail, Duterte had vowed, if elected, to enter into inclusive talks with rebels from the New People's Army (NPA), the military wing of the once outlawed Communist Party of the Philippines (CPP). Peace talks did indeed begin in Norway last August, and got off to a positive start with both sides declaring separate ceasefires and agreeing to further rounds of dialogue, which took place in Oslo in October and Rome in January. At the turn of the year, it appeared steady progress was being made. Yet the peace process crashed to an abrupt halt in early February after a series of armed clashes led both parties to declare their separate ceasefires at an end. Talks were briefly revived in the Netherlands in April, before a fifth round of dialogue scheduled for May was cancelled by Duterte. Since the collapse of the peace process earlier this year, violence has spiraled and deadly attacks have become a frequent occurrence. Mayor Duterte attends the wake of slain communist rebel Leoncio Carparago Pitao leader. Source UNEP September saw several high-profile incidents, with NPA rebels killing 4 government troops in an ambush in Nueva Vizcaya at the start of the month, whilst on the 20th of September, 9 Maoist rebels were slain in a clash with the Philippine army in Carangalan. After several attempts to restart negotiations failed, rhetoric on both sides has become increasingly heated in recent months. In August, Duterte declared war against the Maoists, stating "let's stop talking, start fighting," before describing peace negotiations as a waste of time. See also Philippines' only empty communist schools to be bombed. Duterte. The CPP responded by labeling Duterte's administration as a semi-colonial, anti-peasant regime, whilst claiming that people have no other recourse but to tread the path of militant struggle and collective action. Amid the escalating war of words and with negotiations still stalled, this report examines the reasons why the peace talks faltered and assess the prospects of future dialogue. The history of the modern communist movement in the Philippines dates back to 1968 and the founding of the CPP by a former student activist, Jose Maria Sison, who still leads the organization from self-exile in the Netherlands. The party's armed wing, the NPA, was established a year later with the aim of overthrowing the central government in Manila through a sustained campaign of armed resistance, referred to by the CPP-NPA as a protracted people's war. The movement is rooted in Marxist-Leninist ideology and seeks to establish a political system led by the working classes, which would redistribute land to the poor and expel U.S. influence from the Philippines. The NPA reached the height of its powers in the early 1980s during the dictatorship of Ferdinand Marcos, when it attracted widespread public support and had more than 25,000 members. In the democratic era, the movement has declined in strength but still retains an operational presence in most provinces across the country, and now has around 4,800 active members. Clashes between NPA rebels and Philippine troops continue to occur sporadically as the insurgency approaches its 6th decade, despite repeated military crackdowns. The NPA remains especially strong in poorer rural areas where it enjoys widespread support and exercises de facto control through the collection of revolutionary taxes payments, which Manila describes as extortion. NPA rebels practicing offensive maneuvers. Pick by Edwin Espejo. Peace negotiations have taken place intermittently in past decades between the National Democratic Front (NDFA) political grouping which represents the CPP-NPA in formal talks, and successive governments led by Estrada, Arroyo and Aquino, yet to no avail. The election of Duterte last year signaled renewed hope for peace, and the first round of talks with the NDF in August 2016 produced a landmark result: the declaration of ceasefires by both sides. The commitment held and the parties convened again in Oslo 2 months later, before a third meeting in Rome this January. Yet at the beginning of February, months of careful diplomacy unraveled in a matter of days, whilst efforts to rekindle negotiations in the following months made little progress. Both sides blamed each other as clashes resumed between the army and rebels, leaving many wondering why did the talks falter, and how did the ceasefire collapse so quickly. The trigger for the collapse was the result of the peace process reaching a major sticking point over the release of political prisoners. As the dialogue moved forward, the CPP-NPA had made it clear that the release of imprisoned members was a precondition for the continuation of talks, whereas President Duterte maintained he would not release more prisoners until a formal joint ceasefire agreement had been signed. See also imbecilic to listen to Army on martial law. Filipino Communist Party tells Duterte tensions surrounding the issue were already boiling over before the NPA lifted its unilateral ceasefire on February 1. Duterte followed suit 2 days later after a series of NPA attacks on Philippine troops, immediately terminating the government's ceasefire and accusing the terrorist rebels of wanting another 50 years of war. Whilst unsatisfied demands for a prisoner amnesty served as the trigger for the breakdown of talks earlier this year, there are several more deeply rooted factors which contributed to the failure of dialogue and restrict the chances of ending the insurgency should talks resume. First, the factional nature of the NPA, with armed units present in almost every province across the Philippines, and a lack of centralized operational leadership, makes it difficult for the largely symbolic figureheads of the CPP and NDF, responsible for negotiating with the government, to control the activities of the fighters. Supporters of the CPP-NPA-NDF marching through the streets of Davao City during the funeral march of NPA commander Caparago. Source Edwin Espejo. Whilst a ceasefire is imposed from above, realities on the ground make it easy for violent clashes to occur in a local context. This often leads to further attacks and retaliatory violence, dealing a hammer blow to peace talks at the national level. Second, a lack of trust exists between both sides. This makes progress difficult to sustain as firmly opposed positions have been reinforced over 5 decades of conflict. For example, as soon as the talks collapsed in February, both the government and CPP-NPA quickly reverted from making careful diplomatic overtures and returned to using divisive language describing each other as the enemy. As the months passed, heated rhetoric has replaced the cooperative tones voiced last year, indicating the fragility of progressive dialogue and the difficulty of reversing long-held suspicions. Duterte came to power in 2016 promising to negotiate an end to the Philippines' long-running internal conflicts, yet conditions appear only to have deteriorated. The government is now firefighting on multiple fronts. The army is still battling ISIS-aligned militants in Marawi, whilst at the same time Congress is trying to finalize a long-awaited peace deal with Moro separatist groups. And now, a resurgent communist insurgency is threatening to inflict further bloodshed. The only way of resolving the conflict without a peace accord being signed is to tackle the root causes of the insurgency, which would undermine recruitment and support for the NPA through improving the livelihoods of the Philippines' rural poor. This approach alone, however, would take decades, and without an accompanying peace deal, may not end the violence in its entirety. This approach alone, however, would take decades, and without an accompanying peace deal, may not end the violence in its entirety. To prevent further internal strife, the government and the NPA have a strong imperative to return to the path of negotiation. Duterte is unpredictable, so his declaration that the peace process with the NPA is over does not necessarily signal the end of the road. If there is a lull in rebel attacks and conditions are deemed right, talks may be restarted in the near future. After 5 decades of armed resistance, the cycle of conflict will be difficult to break, yet the revival of the peace process represents the only viable path forward. Unless momentum is regained soon, the Philippines' long-running Maoist insurgency may prove intractable for another generation.